Okay, Year 11, so this is a run through of paper 2 on the 7th of June. So this is a bit simpler this time because you simply answer all the questions in this paper. There's no optionality, so you answer all of the questions. So you will have questions on urban futures, dynamic development, and UK in the 21st century. So 3 human topics. We know that the fieldwork section at the end will be about unseen urban fieldwork. It's exactly the same as the first exam. You've got 1 hour and it will be out of 50 marks and worth 31% of your final grade. So starting with urban futures. So some key vocabulary that we need to make sure that we know. So a megacity is a city with more than 10 million inhabitants. A world city is a city that is a major centre for finance, trade, business, politics, media. It serves the whole world. And examples of world cities would be London, New York, Tokyo. Urban sprawl is a term used to describe where the city grows outwards into the surrounding area. Push and pull factors. Push factors are negative things about the place they're leaving behind that are pushing them away, and pull factors are the perceived positives of the place that they are going to that are pulling them towards that place. Urbanization means the growth of cities, both numerically, so in terms of the number of people that live there, and spatially, which means over space, so it grows to a larger area over time. Then you've got rural to urban migration. This is what's happening in the LIDCs predominantly, where people are moving from the countryside to the towns and cities. Counter-urbanisation is what's happening in the ACs. This is where people move from the town and city to the countryside. Re-urbanisation is where people move back to the city, having left previously. And the final term at the top there is green belt. And the green belt is a belt of countryside that surrounds the UK's main cities to protect that land against any further development. And the aim of the green belt is to stop urban sprawl and stop cities merging together and protect the countryside. So where are the fastest growing cities in the world? And these tend to be in LIDCs. So for example, Lagos, there are 86 extra residents coming into Lagos every hour. EDC cities like in India and China are also growing rapidly. AC cities are growing less fast because they've already seen their growth in the past. What functions do urban areas have? So the functions of an urban area is employment, so providing jobs for people, entertainment, so there are lots of leisure activities for people to do, religious centres, big religious buildings tend to be in urban areas, there are markets where goods are bought and sold, the administration, the organisation of the city takes place there as well, so the governance, the administration in terms of the bins being collected and that kind of thing. And also people live in the urban areas, so residential. Why are cities in LIDCs growing? So what are the causes of rapid urbanisation in LIDCs? So this is where you talk about rural to urban migration, you talk about your push and pull factors. So people are being pushed away from the rural areas because climate change is making farming incredibly difficult, so they're not making much money, they're struggling to make a living. There's a complete lack of job opportunities, lack of services like schools and hospitals, and this means that they have a very poor quality of life, poor life expectancy, etc. The pull factors about the urban areas that are pulling them towards them includes the fact that there are many more job opportunities, both formal and informal jobs. So the ability to go and collect rubbish from a rubbish dump is an informal job that people can do where they can make themselves some money to improve their quality of life. There's also better healthcare, there's better schools and education, there's more leisure activities, and these are the pull factors that cause people to move into the cities. What are the consequences of this rapid urban growth for LIDCs? So you can break this down into social, economic and environmental consequences. Socially, so when they arrive, these migrants, most of them can't get a job, so they end up living in a squatter settlement, and these squatter settlements have no running water, there's no electricity, diseases therefore spread very easily through the squatter settlements. People are living cramped, 6 or 7 sharing a mattress on the floor of a room. The children don't get a very good education, they can't study very well in the houses that they're living in, and they often end up with poor incomes and a poor quality of life. Economically, the squatter settlements look very unsightly, and they put big companies, TNCs, off from investing in places. However, you have got more people in the city and you have got more people working and paying tax, so there is more money to invest in these urban areas in order to make them better going forward. Environmentally, you end up with lots of cars, you end up with lots of congestion and air pollution. Waste is not collected, there are no bin men in the squatter settlements, so the waste builds up and becomes a breeding ground for rats, and diseases spread very easily. What are the opportunities and challenges associated with urbanisation? So there are opportunities of lots of people moving into the cities. These people are able to have a better quality of life than they did in the rural areas because there are more services available. People live longer in the cities, the healthcare is better, there are more jobs, including all of those informal or unofficial jobs like collecting scrap metal from the rubbish dump. People can make more money. However, there are also lots of challenges. So inequality, the urban areas end up with massive extremes in terms of rich versus poor, and segregation, rich areas and poor areas right next to each other. You've got big problems of disease spreading, you've got increased risk of disasters in the slums because the houses there are built in very unstable conditions, close to rivers so that they can flood, on the side of hillsides so that landslides can happen. You end up with overpopulation, not enough jobs for people, and you end up with lots of damage to the environment like air and water pollution. Okay, so moving to ACs, re-urbanisation. Who is re-urbanising and why? So we've got 3 main categories. You've got people aged 25 to 35, singles who are upwardly coming, and they are looking for a job, they're looking for good transport, and they're looking for a social life. And all of that is met in the urban areas. Then you've got retired people who want to move somewhere perhaps with a smaller garden that they can look after. They want to be close to good healthcare facilities. The hospitals tend to be in the urban areas. They want to be close to services like Meals on Wheels and social activities like bingo that they can do so they don't get so isolated. And then you've got university students who are there where the main universities are, where there's good transport, where they can get part-time jobs, etc. Counter-urbanisation or suburbanisation. Suburbanisation is where people move to the outskirts of the city, to the suburbs. Counter-urbanisation is where people move further out into the countryside from the city. So the push factors here, the cities have got a lot of congestion, they've got a lot of pollution, very expensive house prices, high crime rates, these push people away. Pull factors of the countryside include better quality of life, less pollution, more affordable houses, larger houses, bigger gardens, more open space, less crime. And what are the consequences of counter-urbanisation? So we end up with this phenomenon called dormitory villages, which is essentially where the residents are only there to sleep. They then commute to work in the towns and cities in the morning, and as a result there's nobody in the villages during the day. Nobody's using the shops, no one's using the buses, so they close down. And the original elderly residents then become isolated because their services have closed down. Right, so you've got two main case studies that you need to know. You need to know case study of an AC city, which is London, and a case study of an LIDC city, which is Lagos. And you need to know these in quite some detail. So you need to be able to talk about the importance of the cities. You need to be able to talk about ways of life and migration. You need to be able to talk about contemporary challenges, and you need to be able to talk about what they're doing to try to be more sustainable. So London's importance. It is a world city, so it's important on a global scale. It's the financial capital of the world with 250 international banks. So it's important globally. It's also really important nationally for the UK. It holds the UK Parliament, generates 22% of the UK's GDP, which is the equivalent of the entire GDP of Saudi Arabia. And it's also important within Europe as part of Europe's hot banana of important cities together. Migration in London, we've seen big changes to the makeup of the diversity across London. We're still going back to the 2001 census and comparing it to 2011 because we don't yet have the data from the 2021 census. So looking between 2001 and 2011, the black population of London increased 33%, the Asian population of London increased 60%. However, as we know, diversity varies greatly between London's boroughs. It's not universal across the whole city. Redbridge is a very diverse borough. Havering next door doesn't have anywhere near as much diversity. So that's an important point to make. So what are the contemporary challenges facing London? One of the big challenges is transport. The tube is incredibly overcrowded and uncomfortable. 2 million people live and work in different boroughs to each other, so they're having to commute daily. Although after COVID, lots of more people are working from home at least part of the week, so this isn't as much of a problem, perhaps, looking forward. Knife crime is a big issue. There have been 15,000 incidents in 2018, 2019. In 2019, there are 149 deaths. People feel unsafe. It's putting pressure on police resources. You've also got the issue of housing. So house prices have increased massively. They're now 12 times the average wage, which is unaffordable for many people. As a result, there's been a rise in illegal substandard housing where people are renting out their garages, renting out their sheds to people. Then you've got inequality. So you can use a couple of examples for this, but you could use median house price in Kensington, 1.2 million, median house price in Barking and Dagenham, 250,000. So huge inequality between rich and poor, and in terms of standard of living and quality of life for the people at either end of that pay scale. Then you've got sustainability. So what is being done to make London more sustainable in one area? And the area that we've looked at is transport. So there are several things that you can talk about. So you can talk about the congestion charge that was introduced in 2003. So cars have to pay £11.50 a day to drive into central London, plus an extra £10 toxicity charge if they've got an older car. That money made is then reinvested into transport. It has been incredibly successful in reducing congestion and reducing the number of cars coming in. However, that money being reinvested has been used to put lots of roadworks in, which has actually slowed down traffic, which is a bit ironic. Then you've got the Boris Bikes or the Santander cycles, which is where people can hire a bike from different stands across the city. They're zero emissions as they cycle on their bikes, and then they can put them into another docking station elsewhere in the city. However, you have to find the docking stations. They can be quite hard to find. Some of the bikes are broken. Oyster Cards were introduced to speed up travel. Previously, you would have to pay by cash as you got onto the bus. Now it's much more efficient, it's much quicker. People just have to tap and get on. However, there's the issue of people lose their Oyster Cards. Knife crime, in terms of trying to make that more sustainable, you could talk about the #KnifeFree campaign, which is where they put personal stories onto chicken boxes from chicken shops. However, it was massively criticised as racial stereotyping in terms of the people that frequent chicken shops, and it was thought that it would be much better to invest that money in education. Then you've got your LIDC city, so this is Lagos. So again, same different categories. So the importance of Lagos for the world is that it's the main port and airport for the entirety of Western Africa. It's a regional financial hub. It's also incredibly important in the centre of the African film industry, Nollywood. For in Nigeria itself, Lagos is really important. It generates 1/3 of Nigeria's GDP. There are more than 16,000 millionaires who live in Lagos. In terms of migration, we've got rapid rural to urban migration. More than 2,000 people per day are coming into Lagos from the rural areas. There are also people coming into Lagos from the UK, often people with Nigerian roots, Nigerian heritage, who are attracted by the high-tech, very well-paid jobs and in the up-and-coming wealthy areas of Lagos and moving there. There are more than 200 different languages spoken in Lagos, so it's very diverse. What are the contemporary challenges? So you've got some which are very similar to London. So for example, congestion is also a problem in Lagos. You've got the go slow, you've got the rush hour where traffic grinds to a halt and people are forced to have meetings in the back of taxis and try to work that way. You've also got the problem of inequality, similar to London. You've got the mile 12 slums where people are living in very poor standard of living conditions, versus Banana Island, which is a luxury gated community. There are 16,000 millionaires in Lagos, but 2/3 of the people that live there live in slums. So there's huge inequality. Other issues faced by Lagos include blackouts. So the infrastructure, the energy system is not able to cope with the amount of people. Rich people are able to get around this because they have generators that they can just turn on. The poorer people don't, and they have to find lamps that they can use and just try to make do in the evenings, which makes it very difficult for children to do their homework, for people to be able to do much at all in the pitch black. You've also got informal jobs. So you've got people who are making a living from collecting scrap metal from the rubbish dump, for example. This can be very dangerous. Especially if there are fires or you've got injuries from the lorries that are moving around, that kind of thing. People burning blood from animals to try to make chicken feed, not really being protected against the fumes and that kind of thing. Then you've got sustainability. So what are they doing to try to make Lagos more sustainable? So you've got firstly the floating schools, the Makoko floating school, where they've built a school that goes onto the water, a boat essentially. It's got solar panels, so it's powered by the sun. The rainwater is collected, and they've also built it using local materials, local bamboo. And that gives the children an opportunity to go to school, to get an education, which would enable them hopefully to get a good job and be able to move out of poverty. However, it did collapse in 2016 due to heavy rains. They've now rebuilt it, but it's quite a fragile structure. You've also got the electric railway, where they've built this railway that cost £36 billion using a cheap loan from China, which has put them into debt. In return, they had to use Chinese workers to build the railway, so the locals didn't benefit. It's much easier and faster to get into the city. There are less cars on the road, which reduces pollution. However, the local people can't afford to use it. Okay, so this is just like a model answer if you're asked a question about an AC city, about London. So you could pause and just have a little read through if you want to. And then this is a model answer for Lagos. So this is concentrating more on how lifestyle varies across Lagos, how people's way of living varies across the city. So it's focusing on the fact that you've got this inequality, mentioning Banana Island versus Makoko slum. In the slum, you've got community toilets shared between 15 families, diseases spreading easily, no electricity unless you've managed to get an illegal, dangerous hookup. Crime is very high because the slums are self-policed by gangs called the Area Boys. You've got communities within the slums, you've got a way of life, you've got everything within the slums, you've got barbers, you've got people cleaning their nails, you've got people cooking, you've got whole communities there that exist. Meanwhile, the rich are eating out at their posh restaurants. The traditional dish there is jollof rice. Main religion is Christianity, and there are some mega churches where you've got huge gatherings of Christians in airplane hangars or warehouses on a Sunday. And you also see a mixture of modern and more traditional dress. And at the bottom there, you've got a model answer if you're asked a question about sustainability that we've already talked about. You could pause and have a little look at that. Okay, so there are just a few more past questions here. So, explain the characteristics of a world city. So, a world city is a city that is a major centre for finance, trade, business, politics, culture, science, media, has a global reach. International hubs for trade, international banks, headquarters of large TNCs, centres of global communication. Okay, there's a few more questions on there. And then these are some more skills-based questions. So here you've got to draw in the line of best fit to a scatter graph and add an extra point. Here they've given you a table about predicted growth. Now this is really important that you actually look at the key, and it tells you whether the countries are EDCs, LIDCs or ACs. And actually the question here says, describe the pattern in predicted population change for cities in the EDCs shown. So be careful with questions like that you're only talking about the EDCs from the table. You've got outline one cause of rapid urbanisation. So we've talked about push factors like the lack of job opportunities and the associated poor standard of living. One characteristic of a world city, a financial centre. Suburbanisation, moving from the city to the suburbs, the outskirts of the city. Comparing the ways of life in contrasting cities. So this is where you would need to compare London with Lagos. So people living in the AC city of London have access to a wide range of leisure facilities, including museums, theatres, shops. Also access to a large amount of green space with many parks to visit. London is extremely well connected. You've got 5 international airports. However, you have got the inequality with median house price 250,000 Barking and Dagenham, 1.2 million in Kensington. Inequality also exists in Lagos, a city where you've got 16,000 millionaires, but 2/3 of the inhabitants live in slums. Lagos is also a cultural and commercial hub, attracting people from all over Nigeria, the centre of the African film industry, Nollywood. Explain how patterns of migration have changed in a named LIDC city. So talking about the huge number of migrants coming from the rural areas, 2,000 a day, causing huge growth in population, putting a strain on services, expanding slum areas. Then you've also got those international migrants, the highly skilled expats from the UK with Nigerian roots who are drawn to the really high paid, high tech jobs, and they bring their wealth and pay their taxes in the city. How patterns of migration have changed. So we talked about between 2001, 2011, 60% increase in black population in London. 60% increase in Asian population, 33% increase in black population in London. So it's much more multicultural and diverse. You can talk about the fact that different cultures tend to cluster in certain boroughs, in certain areas. So diversity does vary. Redbridge is most diverse, one of most diverse boroughs. Havering is one of the least diverse. And then you've got at the bottom, one initiative, assess the extent to which one named initiative has been successful. So you can talk about congestion charge, that kind of thing. And then these are the not come up yet. So for an LIDC city you've studied, explain its importance. Lagos is the largest city in Nigeria. It's a cultural commercial hub. It generates 1/3 of Nigeria's GDP. It has the region's main port and airport, so it's vital for trade across Western Africa. It's a regional hub for finance and retail, attracts people from all across the region, also home to the African film industry, Nollywood. One initiative to make an LIDC city more sustainable, talk about the Makoko floating school that was built in 2014, using solar power, connecting rainwater to be used as a water supply. So you no longer need to use energy to pipe or carry water on board. Classrooms to hold up to 60 children who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity for education. However, 2016 it collapsed due to heavy rain, and in a city where flooding is common, this is a risk, leading to lost learning time. Compare the contemporary challenges faced by an AC and LIDC you've studied. So this is where we talk about the fact that congestion is a challenge facing both London and Lagos, as so many people are commuting into the cities every day. In Lagos, rush hour is known as the go slow, and in Lagos many of the vehicles are very old, and so pollution, air quality is a big challenge. Housing is a challenge facing London. We talk about the huge rise in house prices, so they're now 12 times the average wage and unaffordable for many. So you've got people living in overcrowded, inadequate housing, people renting out their garages and sheds, so people living in substandard conditions. Similarly, housing is a challenge in Lagos. There are not enough affordable houses for all the migrants coming in, so many end up building their own slum house without electricity, without running water, without sanitation. So inequality is a challenge faced by both cities. In Lagos, we've got 16,000 millionaires living in luxury areas like Banana Island, but in sharp contrast, 2/3 of the inhabitants live in slums like Makoko. In London, median house price ranges from 250,000 in Barking and Dagenham to 1.2 million in Kensington. So in both cities, standard of living and quality of life vary greatly. Again, you've got a couple more skills questions there. So next topic will be dynamic development. So key vocabulary that we need to know. Development means how the wealth and quality of life varies from place to place. ACs are advanced countries. You've got very wealthy people, a wide range of jobs. People have disposable income to be able to spend on services and luxury items. And these are found in Western Europe, North America, Australia. EDCs are emerging and developing countries. These are countries that have made the jump from LIDCs but are not yet quite ACs. And it ranges greatly from those that are nearly ACs to those who are just coming out of the LIDC category. And these include countries like China and India. And within that, you've got the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India and China, and the MINTs, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, who are all forecast to be ACs by 2050. LIDC stands for Low Income Developing Countries. These are the poorest countries. You've got a lack of job opportunities, a lack of different types of jobs. You've got very few services because people are just subsistence farmers growing enough food to feed their own families, and they don't have disposable income to spend on services. How do we measure development? So you've got GNI, gross national income, which is the sum of all the money earned in a country. We can look at that as a total overall figure, or we can look at it per capita, so per person. And we can also look at it purchasing power parity. So GNI per capita, purchasing power parity takes into account the cost of living in that particular country and is a better, fairer way to look at how developed a particular country is. However, GNI only looks at the average wealth. There may well be, as for example in Qatar, a few mega rich people, and most people are relatively poor. When you add everybody's wealth together and divide it by the number of people, it can be very misleading in terms of that country's development status. It's only an economic measure. It doesn't take into account social factors or political factors. So many people think that HDI, Human Development Index, is a better measure because it includes GDP, life expectancy and literacy. So it's a composite measure that looks across economic and social development. And countries are scored from 0 to 1. Happy Planet Index, don't need to worry about, we didn't look at that. We looked at Corruption Index and we looked at how that could be used as a measure of development. Countries that are more democratic compared to those countries where corruption is a big issue for that country, holding them back from developing. Uneven development, now this happens both between and within countries. So obviously you've got the ACs, the EDCs, the LIDCs on a global scale, but you've also got within the UK, you've got the South, which is seen as much more developed than the North in terms of employment, average wage, life expectancy. TNC stands for Transnational Company. This is a company that has branches in at least 2 different countries. Headquarters tend to be in the AC. The factories tend to be in EDCs, LIDCs. Top-down development is where the government makes the decisions. These are expensive, large-scale schemes like dams, where the locals have no say, and it usually involves a big loan from another country. Bottom-up development, on the other hand, is small-scale. An NGO, a charity, goes and spends some time in a particular village and understands what their biggest problems are, and then looks to help them to help themselves. So the Oxfam quote, "Give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man how to fish and he'll feed himself for the rest of his life," is the best way to describe bottom-up schemes. You're helping them to help themselves. However, it is very small scale, and in terms of helping the development of the whole country, it has limited impact. Right, so we've talked about the criticisms of GNI. HDI, although it's a composite measure, doesn't include political development. So it doesn't include democracy or corruption, which lets it down, many people say. What are the human and physical factors that influence global uneven development? So human factors include colonialism, so looking at the past and the colonial history of European countries ruling African nations and basically using their natural resources and their manpower to make money for themselves, which when independence came left those countries really behind and really starting from scratch in terms of building up their own industries and their own way of making money with fewer resources because we had used many of them. Population size can be another factor that influences development. Many people say if you've got a bigger population, you've got a bigger workforce. However, you've also got more people to educate, more people to look after in terms of their health, and more people to immunise, that kind of thing. Physical factors that influence development, so climate. If it's extremely hot or extremely cold or extremely wet, you won't be able to grow good crops. If the land is very mountainous, it's not easy to grow crops, it's not easy to build, it puts TNCs off because it's not easy to build a factory. If you have natural resources like oil or diamonds, you are able to sell them to make money. If you don't have that advantage. So what factors make it hard for countries to break out of poverty? So we've got the trade system of the world, and this tends to be LIDCs selling raw materials that are not worth that much money. The ACs, EDCs take those raw materials and turn them into products which are worth much more. And this keeps the poor countries poor and the rich countries rich. Then you've got debt. All countries are in some sort of debt. The UK is in a huge amount of debt. However, we can afford to make our repayments easily each month. LIDCs that are in debt, the money that they're spending on those debt repayments means less money for them to invest in the infrastructure, in schools, in hospitals, within their country, and holds them back. Political unrest makes it very difficult for countries to develop. You can use the example of Syria. Syria used to be a middle income country. Since the political unrest, it has become a low income country because people are displaced from their homes, people are not able to go to school, people are not able to go to work, and you've got the money being spent on weapons and fighting rather than infrastructure, schools, hospitals. Then we've got the Rostown Model. So the Rostown Model goes through 5 stages as countries develop. So you start out with a traditional society, which is where people are subsistence farmers, just growing crops to feed their own family. As the country slowly starts to develop, they eventually meet the preconditions for takeoff. This basically means they have enough educated people and enough savings or surplus money to be able to reinvest into their country, into improving their industries, their infrastructure, their schools, their hospitals. Takeoff is where the country industrializes. This is where they move from mainly primary jobs to mainly secondary, so from farming to factories. Then you've got the drive to maturity, and finally the society of high mass consumption, which is like the UK is today. So this is where people have disposable income to spend on goods and services. The Millennium Development Goals were set in 2000 with the aim to cut world poverty in half by 2015. So halving extreme poverty, primary education for everyone around the world, combating HIV. And there's been some success, but some areas have not been as successful. We'll look at the Tajikistan example in a minute. Advantages and disadvantages of TNC investment in LIDCs. So when a TNC invests in an LIDC like Tajikistan, they will pay taxes which get invested in the country. They will want to improve the infrastructure which benefits the local people with better roads and railways. There will be jobs with higher incomes for the local workers. However, disadvantages are the TNCs tend to exploit the workers with long hours for little pay, very poor health and safety conditions. And if that TNC finds somewhere safe, somewhere cheaper, they will up and leave with very little notice, and everybody dependent on that industry will lose their jobs. Advantages, disadvantages of debt relief and international aid. So debt relief is an attempt to rebalance global inequality. So ACs are basically repaying the LIDCs for the benefits they receive from colonialism. Disadvantages are that people are not looking after themselves. It discourages people from finding ways to move forward. We're just giving them a handout, basically. That aid can also be tied. So we will give you this aid or this debt relief as long as you only ever buy tractors from us, for example. So the AC benefits. And also governments could be corrupt, and that money can go into private means, private hands, rather than being spent on public facilities. So Tajikistan is our main case study here. Tajikistan is a case study of an LIDC, so low income developing country. Don't get confused with low income developing country city, which is Lagos. The LIDC is Tajikistan. So lots we need to know here. How do we know it's an LIDC? So it has a youthful population, 34% are younger than 14. The GNI per capita is $2,424, which is low. HDI ranking, 129 out of 188 countries, which is low. What has held Tajikistan back from developing? What have been its barriers to development? So it's landlocked, so it's hard to trade, and they have to rely on their neighbours, which makes it very difficult. It's 93% mountainous, which makes it hard to build roads, build buildings, puts TNCs off because it's too expensive, too difficult to build there. They rely on exporting raw materials like apricots, which are perishable, so there's very little time to negotiate a deal. They've had prolonged political unrest. They had a 5-year civil war post-independence, which meant that their money was not going towards the infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals. It was going towards fighting. They've got a very youthful population, so education is difficult. It's difficult to educate that many children. They need to go to school in shifts. Half get to go for the morning, half get to go for the afternoon. So their education is poor, which holds them back from getting good jobs. They're also not able to immunise that many children. It's very difficult to do that and expensive. So in terms of the Rostown model, where is Tajikistan? Tajikistan is at stage 2. It's no longer at stage 1 because they do not rely on subsistence farming. They do export commodities, but they're not yet at stage 3 because they're still reliant on exporting raw materials, not products from factories. In terms of Millennium Development Goals, so they have met the goal to reduce the number living on less than $1.25 a day. 49% in 1999, only 6% in 2006. However, many of those people moved just above $1.25 a day. So they are just slightly better off than that. So still have a poor standard of living. And the figure is much higher in rural areas where it's still a big problem. They've not met the goal to halve the proportion without access to safe drinking water. In rural areas, it's still only 5% of people that have access. They've not met the gender equality goal. Only 18% of seats in Parliament are held by women. They have received aid, so the United Nations invested money for a vaccination programme to reduce tuberculosis. Russia sent £1 billion of weapons to help them to fight the Islamic State. They have received TNC investment. However, there have been a lack of environmental rules, which has led to air pollution, water pollution. Their workers have been exploited, working long hours for little pay. However, these TNCs have paid tax, which has been reinvested in the country and in its infrastructure. And then you've got your two development schemes. You've got your top-down development scheme in Tajikistan, which is the Rogan Dam, and your bottom-up scheme, which is the solar greenhouses or the sun-dried apricots. So the top-down scheme, the Rogan Dam, is on the River Vaksh, which is 100 kilometres northeast of the capital, Dushanbe. And the idea is that they'll build this dam and hydroelectric power will be generated, which would mean they would become energy independent rather than relying on importing energy from other countries. The dam would give them a huge sense of pride. They would be able to sell their surplus water in summer for profit, which would help them to develop as a country. It's a big, large-scale project which would cost them lots of money, so they've had to take out a loan which has put them into debt, which means they're having to pay that each month rather than investing that money in the country. 42,000 people have had to be displaced to make way for the dam and the reservoir. Lots of those people have moved from 8-room houses to 2-room houses, so their standard of living's reduced. In the winter, the water freezes, so hydroelectric power won't work, and the dam will reduce the flow of water down to Uzbekistan, which would impact their cotton farming industry and could lead to conflict and fighting between those two countries. As yet, the Rogan Dam is not yet finished, it's not yet open. Bottom-up scheme, so this is where an NGO, in this case Christian Aid, has come in to work with the local people in the villages. They've raised money and installed solar greenhouses in northern Tajikistan. Previously, the high temperatures damaged the quality of the fruit. Now their yields are much improved. The women no longer have to work in long hours in the sun, so they're not getting as sick from doing that, not working as hard. Profits are 7 times greater than they were before. Families now have more money to send their kids to school, to buy better seeds, to start to move out of poverty. However, it is only very small scale. If you get a question about bottom-up development scheme, you can use Goat Aid, if you learnt that for paper 1, in Tanzania as a bottom-up development scheme in an LIDC. So here you've just got a model answer for Tajikistan. So just putting everything together, so you can stop and have a little look at that. And again, here you've got the top-down, bottom-up model answers if you're asked about those. So some more questions for dynamic development. So explain how development indicators such as life expectancy show evidence of uneven development. So talking about life expectancy varying greatly across different countries. LIDCs tend to have in the 60s, ACs in the 80s, but also that point that life expectancy also varies within countries, reflecting uneven development. You might get a distribution question, so asking you about ACs or LIDCs or EDCs in this case. So distribution is concentrated in Asia, South America, some Central African countries. There are none in North America or Western Europe. So often saying where there are none of something adds your second half of your points. Factors that make it hard to break out of poverty, human factors that are important in determining uneven development. Describe the characteristics of an LIDC, so narrow range of jobs, concentrated in primary, so farmers, fishermen, miners, few services because people don't have disposable income. Most people are subsistence farmers, just growing enough crops to feed their own family. So you can pause and have a read through those. And these are the what's not come up. So define development, so how wealth and quality of life varies from place to place. Evaluate one social measure of development, so HDI includes 3 measures, GDP, life expectancy, literacy, scores from 0 to 1, seen as a good overall measure of development because it's a composite measure and includes both social and economic, however doesn't include a political measure. Explain how political unrest makes it hard for countries to break out of poverty. So this is where people are displaced, so not able to work or farm effectively. Production and distribution of food is disrupted. Money is spent equipping themselves to fight with weapons, etc., which leaves less to invest in infrastructure, education and healthcare. We've talked about debt, we've talked about trade and how that makes it hard for people to break out of poverty. Explain how population and society has influenced economic development of an LIDC you've studied. So the population, Tajikistan has a youthful population, 34% under 14. Providing an education for so many is difficult, so the quality of education is poor, so they can't get good jobs. Too expensive to immunise all those children. As a consequence, a lot of children die. There are so many languages spoken in Tajikistan, this creates potential for conflict. Displacement of people leads to impacts the economy negatively. Explain how technology and politics has influenced the economic development of an LIDC you've studied. So after gaining independence in 1991, Tajikistan suffered a prolonged period of unrest with a 5-year civil war. People were displaced, making farming difficult, disrupting the distribution of food. Money was spent on weapons and fighting, so less was spent on infrastructure, schools and hospitals. Tajikistan is a country with lots of rivers, and the ability to produce electricity via hydroelectric power has and will continue to help Tajikistan's development. That's the technology side. Okay, so you might be asked to look at a table, work out which country is the lowest life expectancy, or calculate the mean GNI per capita. We've looked at this question before, which is where you're asked to describe the pattern of development. Again, remember that Gcse acronym, so general comment about things, specific detail about specific countries or continents, and then exceptions. Where are there none? Then the final topic is UK in the 21st century. So key vocab. So relief means the shape of the land. Water stress is where demand for water is greater than the supply of water. And in the UK, the southeast has the highest population and the lowest rainfall, so has the potential for water stress. We get around this by piping the water in from Wales, for example. Natural increase. This is where you find the difference between the number of babies being born and the number of people dying in that country. So the natural change, not taking into account immigration. Net migration is where you do immigrants coming in minus emigrants leaving to see if you've got more people coming in or more people leaving. Population pyramids, this is where you've got the male on one side, female on the other side, number of people in each age category across that country. For an LIDC, it tends to be a pyramid shape with a high birth rate at the bottom, but also a high death rate as you come up the age categories, and a lower top end, a lower life expectancy. The UK, countries like that tend to be more straight up, straight down, and then it sort of goes in at the top where you've got an even birth rate and death rate. Countries like Japan, where the birth rate is falling, tend to be an inverted triangle. So you've got it narrower at the bottom and higher at the top, where the birth rate is getting lower. The dependency ratio is where you look at the number of children and the number of old people. So under 16s and over 65s divided by the number of people of working age between 16 and 65 and times it by 100 to get that ratio. So have you got a lot of dependents compared to the amount of people you've got working? And that's not good for the economy of a country. Primary jobs are extracting raw materials from the land, so farming, fishing, mining. Secondary jobs are your factory jobs. Tertiary jobs, providing a service like a teacher or a doctor. Quaternary jobs are high-tech jobs that involve ICT or involve phone lines, that kind of thing, call centres. An economic hub is where the economic growth is the strongest. It's where perhaps it's growing the fastest, or it has the potential to grow the fastest in terms of economic growth. A growth pole is where the growth starts and spreads out into the surrounding area. Growth corridor is where two growth poles link together, often along main roads. like motorways. Then you've got the demographic transition model. So there are 5 stages. As countries develop, they move through each of these stages in terms of their population. So the red line is the birth rate, the green line is the death rate, and the blue line is the total population. In stage 1, the birth rate and death rate are both high. These are your traditional society, so a few tribes in the Amazon rainforest would still be at stage 1. So pretty much the same number of babies are born as the number of people that die. So the population remains stable but low. As we move into stage 2, the death rate starts to fall quite fast due to improvements in healthcare, better diets, better clean water supplies, so better standard of living. But the birth rate remains high due to a lack of contraception, the fact that most people are farmers, so they want lots of children to go out and help them to work, and they are used to high infant mortality. So lots of children dying as children. So if they had 10 children, they hope that 2 of them will make it to adulthood. However, more children are starting to survive and the death rate is falling. So this means the population grows rapidly. In stage 3, the birth rate also starts to fall as people are no longer farmers, so they don't need to have as many children. There's now better contraception, so they can plan how many children they want to have. So in this stage, the birth rate is still higher than the death rate, so the population continues to rise, but not as rapidly. In stage 4, the birth rate and death rate become equal again. And you've got pretty much the same number of babies being born as people that are dying, so the population remains stable. In stage 5, some countries have gone into stage 5, like Japan. The birth rate actually falls lower than the death rate. So there are fewer babies being born than the number of people dying. And here the population starts to decrease. The UK is at stage 4 of the demographic transition model. You may well get a question that asks you about the extent to which the UK is losing its significance. So there was a time the UK controlled an empire that ruled a third of the world. In the mid-20th century, this empire disintegrated as countries gained independence and the UK's power reduced significantly. Today, we maintain a degree of control by belonging to international organisations such as the United Nations and NATO. We have a special place in the United Nations as one of only 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which gives us a say over United Nations military action in the future. We also have the head of the Commonwealth. All countries in the Commonwealth are equal, however, the Queen is the head of the Commonwealth. And you can also talk about the importance of the UK film industry, for example, on a global scale. So we need to be able to talk about the UK's ageing population, and you could be asked about the causes, the impacts, or the responses to this. So we have over 14,000 people aged over 100 and an increasing number over 110 due to high standard of living and better diet and a healthier lifestyle. We have elderly that range from those who are very active and contributing to society by spending lots of money on holidays and days out, looking after their grandchildren so that their children can go to work and pay taxes, to those elderly people who are totally dependent on care 24 hours a day. So it varies greatly. The impacts of the UK's ageing population are that we have to spend more tax on pensions, which means there's less money to spend elsewhere. We have to spend more money on the NHS. There's lots of pressure on the NHS from the large number of people with diseases and disabilities of old age, and care homes as well. There's a competition for places and pressure on those. We also find that people have to give up work to become carers for their elderly parents, which means those people pay less tax. So in response to that, the government has increased the pension age. so that people have to work longer before they get a pension, which means they pay tax for longer, which can then be used to fund the NHS and fund pensions. They also try to encourage the elderly to stay active, like for example giving them free swimming, so that they hopefully will not get as sick as quickly and won't need to use the NHS facilities. We need an example of an economic hub. Cambridge is our example. So in the 21st century, it's become an economic hub for high-tech industry. In the past, it was a hub for academia, for education, with its world-class top university. Today, it's all about the high-tech industry, and they've got a business park and a science park there. Why did it become an economic hub? It's very well connected. You've got the M1 straight down to London. It's got Stansted Airport nearby, so international connections. Obviously, it's got the university, so it's got a highly educated workforce that can go into all these industries when they graduate. Flat land makes it very easy to build. However, there are some constraints to Cambridge as an economic hub. It has a green belt surrounding it, which protects the countryside and stops urban sprawl, but limits growth. And lots of people feel the green belt is holding Cambridge back from growing its economy because they're unable to expand their businesses. They're also unable to build more houses, and there's huge demand in Cambridge. And as a result, house prices have risen and local people have been priced out of the market. We also need to be able to talk about the UK's role in one global conflict. And our example is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And we need to try to put a bit of an update of what's happened recently. Basically, this stems back to 2013, when the Ukraine decided to strengthen ties with Russia rather than the EU, which was unpopular with local people and led to protests. So Putin wasn't very happy about that, the Russian president. He took control of Crimea, which was part of the Ukraine, and moved his troops to that border. And fighting has taken place ever since between Ukraine and Russia. The UK's role as part of NATO was to send a rapid response force of 5,000 soldiers to be stationed in the surrounding NATO countries to make sure that there's a presence there. And the countries of NATO were taking turns to lead that, and the UK took its turn in 2017. The United Nations, which the UK is part of, is providing aid for those impacted. The G7, the global 7 big main economies, used to be the G8, but they forced Russia out when they took Crimea. In terms of the more recent update, so in 2022, Russia said they were unhappy that Ukraine wanted to join NATO. Russia demanded that NATO stated that the Ukraine was not allowed to join and withdrew their troops from Eastern Europe. NATO refused, and this was the start of everything. President Zelensky of Ukraine has said the UK's role has been extremely important in supporting Ukraine through this war. We've supplied a huge amount of weapons to the Ukraine army, including anti-tank missiles, which has helped them so far successfully hold off the Russian troops. Boris Johnson also visited President Zelensky in Ukraine as a sign of support, and this was seen as very globally important. Along with lots of other countries, the UK has also imposed sanctions on Russian businesses and rich Russian oligarchs like Roman Abramovich, who was forced to sell Chelsea Football Club. We've also put a settlement scheme in to allow Ukrainian refugees to come and live with families in the UK who have a spare room. However, we have been criticised for the slow speed and the small number of refugees we've taken in compared to countries such as Poland. So there you've just got a model answer for the UK's ageing population and another model answer there for Cambridge Economic Hub. And a few more questions that you can have a look at here. So you can pause and read through these. This question here is about the UK's media exports. So looking at the fact that media exports account for 9% of the UK's total exports, bringing in a significant amount of money. Looking at housing shortages, questions about the UK's ageing population. So this question here, to what extent does the UK's ageing population impact the UK as a whole? So we're talking about the cost to the NHS of diseases and disabilities of old age, less money available for other services, retirement age is raised so people have to work longer in order to get more money from tax that people are not happy about. People have to give up work to look after their elderly relatives, so reducing their income, negatively impacting their standard of living. Although it impacts the UK as a whole, there are certain areas in the UK, mainly the seaside towns, with greater concentrations of elderly people, and the strain on NHS services in those areas is far greater. This is looking at the economic hub, so looking at Cambridge and its science park, and how important it is to the region in terms of bringing a huge amount of money into the economy. This is looking at global influence of UK media and TV. So talking about the fact that Peppa Pig has been broadcast in 180 countries. Newspaper articles recently are speaking about children growing up with English words and pronunciations rather than American pronunciations, which further highlights the influence that these programs have had on a global scale. So what's not come up yet questions. So describe how population density varies across the UK. So the southeast is densely populated, upland areas in Scotland and Wales are sparsely populated. How does land use vary across the UK? So the lowland areas in the southeast are used for urban areas and roads. Flat fertile land in East Anglia is used for agriculture. The upland areas of the north and the west are less urban and tend to be used for agriculture. Housing shortages in the UK and how this links to human and physical characteristics. So the housing shortages are far greater in the southeast. Flat land, availability of water, for example the River Thames, meant settlements grew into cities. So here demand for housing is much greater than supply. In the north and west in Scotland and Wales, the upland mountainous relief makes building difficult. People who live there are isolated, the climate's colder and wetter, so the population is more sparse and demand for housing is less. So housing shortages there are less of an issue. Explain the effects of the UK's ageing population, we've talked about. Explain how the population structure of a named place in the UK has changed. So this would be London. So London's population is growing. It was 8.6 million in 2015, expected to reach 10 million and megacity status by 2030. High number of children aged 0 to 4, which reflects a high birth rate associated with the young population of London. Largest age categories 25 to 35. COVID has had an impact with lots of the immigrants leaving the city. Ethnic structure has changed from 2001 to 2011. Major economic changes in the UK since 2001, including political priorities, changing employment and working hours. So employment, there are more female workers than there were in 2001. There are more self-employed people. COVID has led to a big change with a high number of people now working from home or working flexi hours. Political priorities would include the levelling up of the north. So lots of money and investment has gone into big infrastructure projects in the north. Lots of companies have been encouraged to move there. So the BBC have relocated to near Manchester and Salford, so that they can be seen to be showing investment in the north to help them level up and become more on terms with the south in terms of our development. Outline the pattern of core UK economic hubs. So economic hubs are where the economic growth is strongest. London is our main hub. generating 22% of the UK's GDP. Growth corridors tend to be along main transport routes, the motorways, connecting cities to London like Cambridge, Bristol, Milton Keynes. Smaller growth corridors linked to economic hubs in Birmingham, Manchester and Nottingham. Okay, and then the final question will be your unseen human fieldwork. So this is where they're going to ask you, similar to you had in paper 1, about some unseen urban fieldwork. So examples of urban fieldwork could be a hypothesis that noise decreases the further you get from the town centre. So you'd use a noise meter or an app on your phone that calculates decibels of noise to measure the noise 10 times at 5 locations that get progressively further from the town centre. You would then plot the average noise for each of those sites as a scatter graph, and you would assess whether there is a positive correlation. Or traffic decreases the further you get from the town centre. So standing in a safe location, tally the number of vehicles that pass in a 5-minute period. Repeat this at 4 sites, getting progressively further from the town centre. Do it 3 times at each site to avoid anomalies. Again, plot the average on a scatter graph and look for correlation. You might be asked to look at an extract of somebody's fieldwork that they've done and explain a fieldwork technique that you could use. The go-to fieldwork technique for urban fieldwork is a questionnaire, where you can ask people different questions about the particular issue and then tally up their responses to look at the correlations. You might be asked to plot onto a graph. You might be asked to read or draw a conclusion from a graph. You might be asked to look at a photograph and see how it could be used in an investigation. So the go-to here would be to locate that photograph onto a base map of the place you're looking at so that the person can see exactly where this photo relates to. You might be asked to work out the mean, median, range, or you might be asked to work out, for example, here, the lower quartile value. So this is where you put the values in order, find the median, and then you find halfway between first point and the median, and for the upper quartile, halfway between the median and the end. So the lower quartile here is 12. You might be asked to use evidence from different figures to write a conclusion to a hypothesis. If you get this kind of question, make sure you are referring to the data specifically from the figures. So actually giving figures and relating them to the figure number that you're talking about. Again, primary data collection questionnaire is the go-to. This is a radar graph that plots several different pieces of data onto one graph. So you're enabled to see lots of data for a particular place and compare different places quite easily. 2 different types of data that could be used to identify an economic hub. So air traffic business numbers as an indication of people coming in and out of the place. Number of banks, number of HQs of TNCs, that kind of thing. Again, this is somebody else's data. How would you present the data? So if it's continuous data, like over time or over space, you would do a line graph. If it's discrete data, if it's categories, bar graph. Again, here we've got some more data. Suggest an additional quality of life factor you could look at. So the amount of vandalism or the amount of green space would be examples. I just realised that I'd missed this out from the UK in the 21st century section, so I'm just popping it on the end. So you might be asked about the contribution of ethnic groups to the culture of the UK through food. The question might say food or fashion, but we've looked at food. So this is where you need to say that Chadwell Heath is a diverse community. as a part of a London borough, reflected by the many different types of takeaway food that we've got along Chadwell Heath High Road. Give some examples like Jamaican, Indian, Bangladeshi, Romanian, Italian, to name a few, which gives the local community a wide choice and the ability to experience a wide range of different cultures. Local supermarkets have got big world food aisles to reflect the diversity of the local community, which allows people to get hold of many different types of food. There are large areas devoted to specific ethnic groups, so for example Chinatown in London, where people can go to be fully immersed in Chinese culture and cuisine. However, remember, it's not the case across the whole of the UK. So you've got places like Swanage in Dorset where there's very little diversity, and the only takeaways linked to ethnic groups include one Indian and one Chinese for the whole town. So the culture there is far less influenced by ethnic groups than in Chadwell Heath in London.